Do I have to do the thing where I say good morning again and you guys give me a response so I know we're in there? That's better. My name is John Hollway. I'm the Executive Director here at the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice, and on behalf of my colleagues at the Quattrone Center, Paul Heaton, Ross Miller, Anna Gavin, and our newest, not yet official hire, Marissa Bluestein, who is joining us from the Pennsylvania Innocence Project, it is a great pleasure to welcome you here to actually our 6th annual Spring Symposium, this year titled After the First Step, What's Next in Criminal Justice Reform. This is a high point of the year for us. If you were to read our mission statement, which I'm sure you've all perused very closely on our website, you would see that among the first words in it are to be a research and policy hub, bringing all parts of the criminal justice system together to embrace a systems approach to change. And a symposium like this one that looks at innovative topics in criminal justice reform and brings together national thought leaders from across the different parts of what is in some sense an adversarial system, but in another sense is a system that we all want to improve and ensure the quality of, is very much at the core of what we do. So it's really exciting to have everybody here today and to have an opportunity to talk among each other about so many different topics that are affecting criminal justice reform. To start us off, it is my great pleasure to introduce the Dean of the Law School, Ted Ruger, who has been the Dean since 2015 and has been extraordinarily supportive of the Quattrone Center. We do a lot of things that are not standard in law school pedagogy, and it's been really wonderful to have a Dean who embraces that innovation and supports us in words and in deeds with the kind of work we want to do. So Ted, I want to thank you for your support and welcome you to the podium.
John, and John left his notes here. It says introduce the dean. So, check. We're off to a good start, and it's we are off to a great start when I see the group in the room. This is something that's very important to our mission here at Penn Law School to connect with those from a variety of backgrounds and perspectives and disciplines and institutions, all of which reflected in this room, toward a common goal of reforming our deeply flawed criminal justice system. It is, as I've said on other occasions, both to this group and other groups, it's a propitious time in our society to address these issues. The problems exist as deeply as they ever have, but something different, I should say, thinking about my law school days for many reasons, but one of which a good friend from law school, Professor Rachel Barko, is here and will speak in the next segment. But I think there's very few issues, particularly in our fractious politics, that have become less divided, that have become more bipartisan, a bigger bipartisan consensus being developed. It's hard to think of many issues since I was in law school now almost 25 years ago, or yes, 25 years ago. But one that clearly has changed, and it's so exciting to see the people coming from so many different parts of society and perspectives toward this common goal that our criminal justice system needs to be improved. We're going to be a better country when we improve it. We need all hands on deck, all perspectives, and that's reflected in today's agenda. It's reflected in our speaker, Mark Holden, which is reflected in the different faculty and fellows who are here, who bring their own intelligence and research agenda to bear. And it's reflected in the work of the Quattrone Center, which is single-mindedly focused on reforming the criminal justice system, using all of the interdisciplinary techniques that a great university like the University of Pennsylvania has, and the methodologies of large data studies that dovetail with the individual narratives of people wrongfully convicted and racial bias and other problems to make a really powerful agenda for change. And indeed, in ways I won't go into here because it's a long list, the work of the Quattrone Center, our researchers, our fellows, others that have been funded, is producing tangible change in court decisions on issues like misdemeanor bail reform, on issues like improving, or even in the case of a decision yesterday in Travis County, Texas, to establish a public defender system for the first time, thanks to the work of the Quattrone Center. So this is an academic center that really does translate into policy impact, and all of you are a part of that, and we welcome you on that, initiative now and going forward. I do want to acknowledge and thank the transformative support of Frank and Denise Quattrone, who are here. Thank you both. And you're supportive in so many ways, both with the resources to launch this center a few years ago, as well as just your continuing vision and support and connections, and really, this is an exciting time. It's an exciting place and a really exciting institution, and it's led by two tremendous leaders, Paul Heaton and John Hallway, and I'm really appreciative of the work both of you are doing. And I'll turn it back to John to get us right into the agenda.
Last thing on my note says Ted crushes it. That was in brackets. So I'd like to take a second to kind of set the stage for what we're going to be doing over the next 2 days, and to kind of look backwards to help us look forward. So as Dean Ruger said, our founding donors, Frank and Denise Quattrone, are here, and in the 2011-2012 timeframe, they had kind of a crazy idea, and the idea was that we could create a center in a law school, but in a law school that had access to interdisciplinary scholars, that if we brought people together with data, that we could use that data to unify people who had been rendered adversarial by anecdotes and emotions. We'd use that data to unify people and drive change. And one of the things that they said at the time was it wasn't clear to them why a lot of the issues in criminal justice reform were actually all that controversial. We may disagree about what ought to be a crime, and we may disagree about what to do with somebody once they've committed a crime, but we all pretty much agree that we should probably only punish people who have actually committed crimes, right? That's a place where we can all agree. And so the Quattrone Center was founded to start at that place, to say, what can we do to ensure the accuracy of the criminal justice system and prevent errors in the criminal justice system going forward? How do we explain to people not just the moral issues, but the economic issues and the impact of some of the policies that we're having, so that we can unify people around reforms that are smart and thoughtful and will actually make sense to reduce crime? And at the time, there was this sense that bipartisan consolidation was happening, that criminal justice was not a partisan issue. And so we got started on that, and we got started bringing people together at events like this and others. And since that time, we've taken quality improvement approaches from places like aviation and transportation and healthcare, and we've brought those quality improvements to the criminal justice system. We've conducted root cause analyses and sentinel event reviews in cases where the criminal justice system gets it wrong, to learn from them specific environmental changes that we can make to prevent those errors next time. We've done that in multiple jurisdictions around the country, across multiple types of error. We've consulted with and collaborated with prosecutors who are implementing conviction integrity units. So one of the things that has changed, in sort of a large scale, is prosecutors are recognizing their own role in criminal justice reform, their own obligation as leaders of law enforcement to improve the quality of their system, both in terms of accuracy, but also in terms of thoughtful utilitarian approaches to dealing with people who commit crimes, to reduce recidivism, to reduce incarceration. If a policy's not working, it's our obligation to the public to make those changes and to follow the data and not the emotion involved in criminal justice. We've researched racial disparities in plea bargaining cases in San Francisco, and we've done actually some groundbreaking work on the effects of cash bail, particularly in Houston, but the work is applicable in other jurisdictions that has led directly to, I think, a widespread recognition that low-level cash bail for nonviolent offenders is simply not useful in dealing with the problems of the actions that are being committed, and it doesn't actually reduce crime. To the contrary, it may actually contribute to crime in a jurisdiction. So we've helped to build a widespread consensus about some of the factors that are feeding into mass incarceration, and they're not working. And that's wonderful, but when you make change in Houston, the third largest county in the United States, there are still 3,141 other counties in the United States that aren't required to do what Houston just did, even though it was smart and the right thing to do, right? We still have this issue of change taking time. And Denise, last night when you were feted by the Innocence Project, you said something that really struck me. Denise was talking about how long it takes us to learn about people who have been exonerated and how long it takes us to make their cases right, often taking, even a decade after we know there's been a mistake to rectify that mistake. And she pointed out an exoneree who'd been incarcerated for 45 years. And she said, if I got in my car and I turned the ignition and it didn't go for 45 years, how long would it take me to go get another car and solve that problem? Right? The criminal justice system's feedback loops are slow. We're fragmented. These jurisdictions operate in islands. They're not answerable to people. And so even though criminal justice reform is, I think, in a position where we are ripe for change, where I think more and more people are willing to watch and look at the data, willing to follow the data, everybody wants to do the right thing, and for both moral and economic reasons, we want to do the right thing. The change takes time. The federal government has an important role to play in leading the country because they do have unified practices that go across all of our jurisdictions. And so even though when we make change in the federal system, it doesn't immediately require change in the state system, the federal criminal justice system, when they make change, leads by example and sends signals to the rest of the country about where we should be going and how we view criminal justice as a nation. And so in that context, and especially given all of the other divisions that we have at the federal level in legislation, it was a really exciting accomplishment for the federal government to pass the First Step Act recently. And I think it does speak to the national trends that unify us behind criminal justice reform, the national belief that mass incarceration is not working and needs to be changed. And it had 13 senatorial sponsors, 16 Democrats, 15 Republicans, and 1 independent, which I'm sure was by design and designed to show the truly bipartisan nature of what we were doing. And it had a lot of really important reforms to the federal correctional system. It improved good time credits to accelerate the release of people whose incarceration was serving no good purpose. It improved programmatic support for people during their imprisonment to help them build skills that would allow them to rebuild their lives after their release. It enhanced incentives for them to participate in those programs during their incarceration. It expanded pre-release custody changes so that halfway houses and home supervision could be more pronounced to reduce incarceration. And it did things like that were thoughtful about post-conviction release, like providing identification cards to prisoners before their release so that they would have the beginnings of the administrative record necessary to then go build a life, to build a credit history, to get a job, to do the things that you need, so that we're not just putting you in prison and forgetting about you. We're actually hoping then to use prison as a useful period to improve your ability to come back and make a sustainable life after your release. There was another part of the First Step Act that struck me, which was some of the changes that it makes for female prisoners. Eliminating the shackling, for example, of pregnant female inmates, and ensuring feminine hygiene products are available for all inmates. These things, I think, are important just because they're the right thing to do, and they convey a dignity on the people who are in these situations that I don't think as a country we have done very well over the past 2 decades. And so there's a lot to be really excited about in the First Step Act. It's also important, I think, that to realize the thought that went into calling it the First Step Act. Because while it is, I think, a signature legislative achievement of this administration and something we should all be proud of as forward progress, it's also abundantly clear that it's not nearly enough, even at the federal level, and that even if we did enough at the federal level, that wouldn't be enough for us as a country. If you released every federal prison inmate, you would release somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 to 200,000 people. That's about 10% of the incarcerated population in the United States. Plus, while this is a wonderful set of reforms for sentencing and prison, it doesn't address the core reason that the Quattrone Center was created, for example, which is the more than 2,500 people who've been wrongfully convicted of crimes they didn't commit and who've served 21,000 plus years of incarceration for those crimes. It doesn't change issues of pretrial detention. It doesn't change issues of racial disparity. And we're going to talk about a lot of those issues over the next 2 days. We're going to talk about the continued struggle to implement best practices in eyewitness identification. We're going to talk about the need for improved pretrial support and representation around court appearances so that we can reduce tomorrow's errors, particularly in lower level cases where people might just be pleading guilty to things they didn't do because of administrative convenience, because they don't trust the system to get it right. We're going to talk about the rapid deployment of scientific techniques before they're ready for prime time, which we know has plagued what we're doing, including tomorrow's topic is going to be rapid DNA testing and whether or not we're out over our ski tips just the way we were with field drug testing and other things, such that we'll find ourselves with a large group of convictions that we have to walk backwards because all of a sudden we've learned that the technology didn't have the reliability that we thought we did. It seems like every time we have somebody here that I'm excited about, it's a former classmate of Ted's. We've been trying to get Rachel Barkow here since year one, and so we're delighted to have persevered, and she'll be speaking later this morning to talk about her new book, which is a terrific and very thoughtful approach to breaking cycles of mass incarceration. We have Michelle Phelps here again later today to talk about her new book, which looks at kind of a historical approach of criminal justice reform to guide us in our reform efforts. And we will close tomorrow by talking about the prosecutor as an agent of reform in a couple of different ways, how they deal with issues of police misconduct and how databases to store that information get shared. We'll talk about how the so-called progressive prosecutor wave has gotten started, how it has worked in practice, what we can learn from that to ensure that we have prosecutors who are willing, ready, and able to be thoughtful about their reform policies going forward. And we will end tomorrow afternoon with a conversation about absolute immunity. You know, this idea, I think if I were to ask any of you in the audience, who thinks it's a good idea to have a system where a prosecutor, if a prosecutor were to intentionally withhold evidence of innocence in a capital case, there would be no accountability to that prosecutor as an individual? Raise your hand if you think that's a great idea. And yet that's the system that we find ourselves in, and while we've done wonderful things with the First Step Act, I have to say we've found virtually no legislative enthusiasm to deal with policies like that. So we'll talk about that tomorrow and what we might be able to do to change that. So there's clearly lots still to do. But we all know that when we are unable to unite on other issues, that has ripple effects through our society, and the converse is true as well. When we find things on which we can agree, when we find those things on which we can unify, that can have a positive ripple effect to allow us to then unify on other issues. And so that, I think, is really the wonderful, I hope, legacy of the First Step Act, that it has reminded us that there are things we can do together as a country. There are things that don't divide us along the letters R and D, right? That we can come together to make change, and that we can do so in ways that treat people with an inherent dignity and inherent humanity. That some human needs are universal, and one of those is the need for all of us in our society, no matter where we are in it, to be recognized as human, and for our community to provide those people with basic human needs. And I think those two things, both the unification and the humanity of it, would not have happened but for the incredible work of our keynote speaker, Mark Holden, the Senior Vice President of Koch Industries. When I was preparing to introduce Mark, what struck me about his bio is that he actually spent time when he was in college and law school working in a prison during his breaks. And that gave Mark, I think, a unique, sort of sadly, a unique insight, right, into the fact that prisoners are people, and that there are people there but for the grace of God, you know, go us. That the people in these prisons are hardworking people, people who care, people who have families, people who want to improve their lives, and the way we treat them in prison makes it next to impossible for them to ever get out of the system in a way that they can actually achieve those goals, which would then have the effect of reducing crime over time. And when he realized how difficult it was to re-enter society, and he realized that incarcerated and evil are not the same thing, he took a position, stepped forward and took a public voice and helped Koch Industries be a really wonderful, vocal, and high-profile leader of initiatives that would help people come back and reestablish themselves in society. I'm going to name Ban the Box as one initiative, but certainly there have been many. And I think the Koch website and Koch's pronouncements and their words and deeds show that they're evaluating employees based on their potential, not on their past. And that doesn't sound like it should be that difficult, but talk to your average HR rep, man, and it's tough to implement. And it's, I think, the leadership position that they've taken is really commendable. There are a lot of initiatives that Mark has been involved with, both out in front and behind the scenes. But it's no coincidence that the core of this First Step Act has that sense of humanity and inherent dignity and the need for renewed hope and opportunity for all the people in our society. The way that we help the least fortunate among us and the way that we create opportunity for those who have the least access to it is what will define us as a society. Mark's intense recognition of that has made this law better. It's why we want to have him come talk to you today. I could not be happier to welcome him to the podium. Mark, come join us, please.
Good morning, everybody. Make sure good morning.
See, he got a response.
All right. I'm the talent. Sorry, John. That's how it works. Hey, it's great to be here. At first, Quattrones, thank you so much for everything you're doing. It's really changing things in a big way.
Thank you.
And we're glad to partner with you however we can. Thank you, Dean, for being here. And my friend Rachel Barco for being here as well. And my colleagues from Koch. So I want to start just to make sure everybody understands. I've been a big believer in criminal justice reform pretty much my whole life. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But what we do at Koch, by and large, is because of Charles Koch. And this is something Charles deeply believes in. And Charles, back when the war on drugs started, and I always have to say this anytime I mention the war on drugs, this is an update. Drugs won again this year. They've won every year that we've had a war on drugs, unfortunately. Hopefully that'll change at some point when we start doing more and more smart things and not just dumb things in our criminal justice system. But Charles was against the war on drugs. He's against mandatory minimums. And he's always been someone who wants to break barriers to opportunity. And if you look at our criminal justice system, there are a lot of barriers out there to opportunity for people. But the criminal justice system has to be, if not the biggest barrier, one of the biggest ones. And in my opinion, it's the gravest injustice of our lifetime, of my lifetime at least I think so. And there are a lot of injustices out there, don't get me wrong. So I want to talk about how I got involved in this. And it really gets back to proximity. Brian Stevenson talks about that in Just Mercy, that to care about an issue, you have to be close to it, because once you're close to it, you understand the cause and the problem, and you're also close, hopefully, to the fix, to the solution. And second chances have been a big deal in my life. I've needed a lot of second chances, and John talked about my work when I was in college for 3 years working in the Worcester County House of Correction. And that didn't just happen out of nowhere. What happened was I was 17 years old, and I was overserved and got in a fight and allegedly assaulted someone and was arrested. And I was fortunate enough to live across the street from the sheriff of Worcester County, Frank Degnan, who was a great guy. And he hired me to work about 2 months later in the Worcester County House of Correction, and the charges went away. So I got a second chance early on. And if I didn't get that second chance, I probably wouldn't be here, because I came from a working class family. We had no resources, really. We didn't know a lot of people other than Sheriff Degnan, which was a good person to know. But it really changed my trajectory, looking back on it now, because again, I would have had a criminal record, and people with criminal records, as we know, and we'll talk about that, have a hard time overcoming that unless they have resources or help. And really what happened was, when I worked in the prison, I saw a bunch of people that I grew up with who were from my neighborhood, from the schools I went to, and they were not working there, they were living there. And their lives were over, basically. I'd lost track of them in high school and in junior high, but what they had done is basically had no support, dropped out of school, became drug addicts, was over. There were no reentry programs. And so that was an eye-opener for me, for someone who was not particularly enlightened as a 17 or 18-year-old, that there was something wrong with this system. And that stuck with me for a long time. It still sticks with me today, and I'm so excited to be here today to talk about some of the fixes that we see and what we've seen the last few years happen, starting down in Texas, obviously, with the reforms, but all the progress that we have made, which we want to celebrate, but there's so much more to do. And so, first I just want to talk a little bit about where we used to be, which was the... Oh, nice, okay, yeah. Uh-oh.
Yeah.
Dang. I'm not good with the technology stuff, like slides. All right, that's okay. Thank you. Before we start though, I want to just show a few of the groups that we've worked with, and this is one of these issues, the coalitions that have been built are so important because it's one of these issues that it affected everybody. The Tough on Crime era, both parties did it, we know this. The H.W. Bush administration, before that there were other administrations as well, and then the Clinton crime bill in 94. So everybody had a part in this, and so we've got groups from the center, the left, the right, you name it, and these coalitions have been very effective. And what they've been able to do is, talking to the different constituencies in their states and where they live, bring about these reforms over the past several years, and that's very important. So we've shifted now from the tough on crime era to the smart on crime era. Smart on crime, soft on taxpayers. So when someone talks about tough on crime, what they're really saying is it was a time period where we wasted a lot of money, ruined a lot of lives, devastated communities, had no data to support anything that we thought was happening. That's what the tough on crime era was. The smart on crime era is all data-driven and evidence-based, and it's designed to help people improve their lives and remove barriers to opportunity. These are our guideposts to reform. First is enhancing public safety, keeping communities safe. Second is ensure equal rights, equal justice. That's the whole idea of a justice system. And last is provide real second chances for those who are seeking redemption. That's it, pretty simple. We look at criminal justice reform issues through three different lenses: the moral case, the constitutional case, and the fiscal case. We're going to spend most of the time talking about the moral case because that's where we get the reforms actually coming. I mean, it's one of these things I always talk about. The reforms started because of the fiscal case when down in Texas and different red states, they saw how much they were spending on incarcerating people and the really bad outcomes they were getting. That led to reforms. And I like to say that the legislators, left and right, blue and red states, they come for the savings, but they stay for the salvation. That's the key thing. And it is all about morality. And what we have in our criminal justice system is in my opinion, a completely ineffective, in many ways, an immoral system. And again, I'm going to quote Brian Stevenson. It's a system that treats the rich and guilty better than it does the poor and the innocent. It's a two-tiered system. It is a pay-to-play system. It's a failed big government program from beginning to end. I was talking earlier before we came in here about when I hear state legislators talk about our recidivism rate is only 30% or 40%. And I said the other day when I was in Phoenix, Arizona, talking about these issues that I went to UMass. I'm a pass-fail guy. I respect a gentleman's D as much as the next guy, but if your bridges were falling down at a 40% rate, right, or your buildings were just imploding at a 40% rate, that would be a huge, huge crisis. But somehow we like to say that, hey, we only have 40% of our human beings, people, our neighbors, our citizens coming back and forth to prison, getting worse over time and hurting their families and hurting their communities. And it's completely disgraceful. But the system is set up for failure. If you don't have resources, you're going to get run over. It's a resource-based system. We know this from beginning to end. We talked a little bit, I heard you mention cash bail. There's no, all right, let me back up. The Constitution talks in the 8th Amendment about bail. It's allowed, but it shouldn't be excessive. But somehow we've turned that into everybody has to pay something. No one gets to be free pending the outcome of their case unless they pay some cash bail in jurisdictions. There's nothing in the Constitution about that. There's no commerce clause in the 8th Amendment. It's not about making money. And really the bottom line is that people should be free pending the outcome of their case unless they're a threat to public safety or a flight risk. Other than that, they should be home, because we know what happens. The next thing, when you don't have resources. Another part of the Constitution that we somehow fail to follow all the time, the 6th Amendment. Access to justice, access to a qualified, effective counsel to defend you, as it says in the 6th Amendment. I mean, defense lawyers are basically the only occupation mentioned in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, the 6th Amendment. Yet we don't follow that, and we know what happens. People who are detained pre-trial, they want to get back home, they don't want to lose their homes, they don't want to lose their families, they don't want to lose their jobs, they plead guilty to something. Then they get out, they can't stay in the apartment anymore because you don't have someone, if you have a criminal record, you can't be there, you can't get a job. It all works against people who lack resources, our criminal justice system. That's completely immoral and disgusting. I think everybody agrees, so I'll move on. But one last thing that is really terrible about our criminal justice system, and the whole idea of America being a country of second chances, right? That's where people came for a new life, is the fact that once you pay your debt to society, you've served your time, you paid your fine, whatever it is, we don't forgive the debt, ever. Never, ever. Even for misdemeanors. That is completely immoral. And that's one of the issues that drives more and more crime and more poverty, is the fact that we never let anyone up off the floor once they've been charged with a crime, convicted of a crime, and have paid their due. And that is something we need to change. There were 50,000, this crowd probably knows this already, 50,000 collateral consequences to a criminal conviction in this country. And they keep you from all the basic necessities. It's just insane. It should not be a one-size-fits-all approach. We think that basically you should get all your rights back once you paid your debt to society, unless there's a public safety reason that can be shown not to get it back. And that's why we were big proponents of Amendment 4 in Florida, the voting rights. We thought that was great. We think more and more of that has to happen, and we're going to keep fighting for that. But we have a system, again, I'll be quick here. It over-criminalizes, over-prosecutes, over-sentences, over-incarcerates, over-burdens people who can least afford to deal with those burdens. Real quick, one of the problems in our system for sure, it kind of sets up everything else. This is the progression of federal crimes in the federal code. We started back at the founding with 3 of them. I think it was counterfeiting and treason and piracy. We had a lot of pirates back then. We overcame that. By the time of the 1900, we had 3 dozen or so. Then when you see that with the war on drugs, it just exploded, the whole thing, from 3,000 to 5,000 plus. We have 5,000 plus because we don't know how many federal criminal laws we have. We don't know how many federal criminal regulations we have. We think it's 5,000 or so laws and 5,000 or so, 300,000 or so federal criminal regulations. And that gets back to the whole situation generally. What's wrong with the way our government looks at these issues? They just keep adding things and adding things and adding things. And it gives prosecutors an endless toolkit to ensnare people. I mean, it goes back to the Stalin years, not to compare prosecutors in the United States to Stalinist tactics, but the chief of police for Stalin said that, what was it? Show me the person, I'll show you the crime. We've got the same situation here. Again, any prosecutors here, I'm not saying you're like Stalin, but some of the tactics aren't so good. So what does that mean? It means that we don't know how many laws we have, and when DOJ's been asked to tabulate and enumerate how many federal criminal laws we have, they've been asked to do it twice. Both times they've said they can't do it, it's too hard. And as I always say, only in Washington, D.C. has had an acceptable answer. In your kid's 5th grade class, they get an F. So we don't know how many federal criminal laws we have. Maybe someday we will. We probably need a lot less. 1 in 3 U.S. adults have a criminal record. That's as many people with a criminal record that have a college degree. There was new data that came out from the Institute for Justice, Brian Stevenson's group, that said that, I'm going to get this right, half of Americans have family members that have been or are incarcerated. So you got half the country I mean, think about that. I mean, what brings us together as a country anymore? I'm not really sure what it is all the time. Criminal justice reform is some, but apparently it's having someone you know in your family who's been incarcerated. And I know I have that in my family. That isn't including me. My charges were dropped, for the record. But no, that's a big deal. It's terrible. You know these details as well. 4% of the world's population, almost 25% of the world's prison population. Number one overall incarceration, number one at rate of incarceration. This just shows the whole uprise because of the war on drugs, the failed war on drugs. We're up to almost 2 million people today. And the war on drugs, in my opinion, talked about it earlier, has been a complete failure. The way we've handled these issues was a complete failure, but it continues, and hopefully that's going to start to change over the next few years as we talk about reforming more and more of our state and federal criminal justice systems and criminal codes. But it's really a situation now where we've decided to incarcerate people basically for anything that might happen if they're poor. So if you're caught doing something, if you again have resources, you'll probably be okay, but if not, you're going to get locked up, and once you're locked up, things go downhill quickly. We spend way too much money on our criminal justice system overall, an estimated approximately $250 billion a year each year overall. The social costs are up to, I think it's $1 trillion a year. $80 billion a year on incarceration every single year. That's 3 to 4 times more per capita than we spend on K through 12 education in this country. And it's one of these things where, I mean, if you are what you eat, you definitely are what you spend. Or as the noted philosopher Rasheed Wallace would say, ball don't lie. And I think what we have here is we care more about locking people up than we do educating them. And that, again, I think is immoral. Some of the other issues, incarceration and the criminal record, create a lot of barriers to opportunity that we've talked about already, from collateral consequences. We've got 1 in 28 children, over 5 million, have or have had a parent in prison. And the odds for those individuals to end up in the system are pretty high, much higher than if you don't have a parent in prison. So it's just kind of the cycle keeps repeating itself again and again. A Villanova study from a few years ago said if we hadn't had these mass incarceration, over-incarceration, that poverty could have decreased by more than 20%, and that makes sense because at the end of the day, the criminal justice system is a poverty trap. That's all it is. I mean, there are people in prison, don't get me wrong, who need to be there. Hopefully it could be rehabilitated, but by and large, it's a poverty trap, and it isn't doing what it should be doing, keeping us safe and giving people second chances, which is what it should be all about. This is really kind of elementary and brief, but these are the issues we care about, generally speaking, from legislation, intent and accountability, mens rea. I don't know, for some reason that's become controversial. It doesn't make any sense to me. Especially if you are a public defender defending someone on a drug crime. Those are the most notorious, in my opinion, or among the most notorious. There are other people here much more vested in this than me, but drug crimes are crimes without intent. Seen that again and again. They just kind of pick and choose whatever they want to do, they being the prosecutors, go after someone. But we think there needs to be real intent standards. We want to end asset forfeiture. I am not in any way a constitutional law scholar. I just don't understand how asset forfeiture is constitutional, Fourth and Fifth Amendment and other issues. But when I was up in Michigan last year at a conference of a bunch of Michigan prosecutors, they were yelling and screaming at me about how it is. So maybe in Michigan it is, I don't know. Prosecution, there needs to be a lot of change, in my opinion, of prosecution, of how prosecutors work. I have total respect for them. Most of them all do the right thing. But the whole system's just, it's as everyone knows, it's a plea bargain system, not a justice system, not a trial system. I think we should go back to the whole idea of what was in the Constitution about the 3 branches of government, and prosecutors aren't a branch of government, but they become a kind of super branch of government within the judicial branch of government, and that prosecutors shouldn't have so much power. We should get rid of the trial penalty. I don't understand, Rachel or Barry or someone could help me understand how people get longer sentences because they go to trial and you know, you use your Sixth Amendment right to confront and have a trial, you then get a longer sentence. I don't understand that. That seems unconstitutional. So I'd like to rein in back prosecutors to their essential role of making sure that the system has someone who's prosecuting, and then make sure, obviously, from a Sixth Amendment reform perspective, that people who need lawyers get lawyers, court-appointed lawyers, public defenders. 80% or more of the people in the system don't get an advocate who's effective or full-time. And to me, that seems like it's a violation of the Sixth Amendment. It creates a constitutional crisis because the government, the state that's trying to take away your life, liberty, and property in the pursuit of happiness is also not giving you the lawyer they're supposed to give you. And so there needs to be something there as well, and I know a lot of people are working on that. The sentencing issues, I'm not a fan of mandatory minimums. I think that we should have judges do their job, trust them to make the right calls, move on. I'd get rid of all mandatory minimums or very much limit them if it were up to me, but it's not. The collateral consequences, we've talked about some, and talked about some more, but restoration of rights is a huge thing. We were down in North Carolina yesterday in Raleigh. They have an expungement bill they're putting through, and it's bipartisan. It's very exciting. We support that bill. It's going to hopefully pass today. We supported what happened in Pennsylvania with Clean Slate. That's great too. Utah's done it. That's awesome. There's more and more expungement happening. But what they're expunging, it's good, but it's a lot of misdemeanors, and just we're nibbling around the edges. So, and I understand you got your toe in the water, we're moving forward, we talked about the First Step Act, we'll talk about that a little more, but we really need to accelerate all of this. Because if you look at how we did it in the 80s and 90s, we went 110,000 miles an hour the other way with the federal government. And what's the data? For every 10 days on average from 1990 to 2005, we built a new jail or prison in this country. I mean, that's crazy. So these are all good things, but it has to happen a lot more, and more people have to call it out. What we've seen, like yesterday we were down there, I was with David Plouffe, who's, you know, he was Obama's campaign manager, and we had a left-right coalition, center coalition, brought a lot of people together. Darrell Atkinson was there, if you know him. And we need more and more of everybody talking out and talking about this and demanding that we reform the system. It's the only way it's going to happen, because otherwise I fear that people are going to say, hey, we did criminal justice reform last year, or we did it this year, but it's more and more needs to happen. Everyone knows the Texas story. It's a great story. Closed 8 prisons, lowest crime rate since the 60s, over $4 billion saved. I mean, that's what we want to see. And it's based on data-driven practices, evidence-based practices, not on who could be tougher on crime or any of that nonsense. Soft on crime in Georgia, you can see that yourself. Again, great outcomes. There's pretty much every state that's done it in a meaningful way and kept coming back for it. It's got better and better outcomes, and that leads to more reforms. That's what we want to see. Michigan, in my opinion, has done a great job. They've closed prisons, they've reduced their crime rates, reduced their incarceration rates, reduced their recidivism rates, but they have, in my opinion, the best type of reentry programs within their prisons. They have a Calvin College education program that's inside the prison that the inmates, if they qualify for it, obviously they can graduate just the same degree that you would get on the main campus. And the other thing it does is they provide a scholarship to the children of the inmates who complete the course. So you talk about, obviously, people who are incarcerated have a lot of guilt and regret and shame and stigma about what happened to them while they're incarcerated. They can't take care of their families. This is a way they can help their families break that chain, break that cycle by getting a college degree, scholarship free. So that's really cool. They also have a vocational village there where they're training people on all these jobs that are out there right now. 7 million jobs are open in the United States, 7 million plus. And these jobs go wanting. People aren't skilled up enough to do them, to work, whether it's welding, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, you name it. They have a vocational village at 2 of their prisons. They're basically, the people coming out are not going back in. They're getting 94% of the people are being hired in really good jobs. And the recidivism rate, from what I understand, is like less than 4%. So it's good stuff, and it's common sense. I mean, it just makes sense. We know that from the DOJ study from 2013, where they looked at in-prison education programs in the Bureau of Prison, and it reduced recidivism for the rates for the individuals who took it by almost 45%, and it defrayed, for every dollar spent on in-prison education, it defrayed up to $6 of future incarceration costs in the first 2 years. And this is like, it's malpractice. It should be a crime if every prison doesn't do this, quite frankly. And we're seeing more and more of it happen. I think Michigan is the gold standard, and hopefully, at some point, hopefully we have fewer prisons, fewer people in prison, and we'll have more prisons like this, so when people come out, they don't come back in. That's our goal. The prison is a one-time event, if at all. So the First Step Act, I've already talked, John, you hit the highlights really well. I really, when you brought up the whole thing about, hey, we're not going to shackle people anymore while they're giving birth, I just like, I mean, I don't even know if they do that in Game of Thrones anymore, but the fact that we needed a law for that is just crazy. It tells you how out of control things are. So I'm not going to go too much on the First Step Act. I was going to talk about how it all came to be, because it's kind of an interesting story for sure, I think. But one of the things on the First Step Act that bothers me is when I've had a couple of good friends of mine when I've been on panels who don't like Trump. I mean, shocking, people don't like Trump, right? But they are very dismissive of the First Step Act. They'll say it's unremarkable or it's modest. And I understand what they're saying, because we all want more. But my point of view is, when you've never ever done anything in your life like this, in our lifetime, meaning something that a criminal justice bill at the federal level that's less punitive, more redemptive, more restorative, that's a big deal. That isn't modest. We want more, but I said to one person who was saying it, this was earlier this year when Matthew Charles got out, and this person was saying it's modest, it doesn't do much. I said, well, you should call Matthew Charles and ask him what he thinks about it, because he's out now because of it. That doesn't mean we don't accelerate everything, but we need to celebrate this. And I worry that if we're really going to start to say we like a bill or don't like a bill or a law that's passed because of the president who passes it, that's not going to work. I mean, we were working on this bill back in 13 and 14 when it first came up. We worked with Valerie Jarrett and the Obama administration. I would have loved to have passed it then. And we've worked with Jared Kushner, who did a phenomenal job, and President Trump, who was great on this issue. And we want to keep doing that. I mean, that's why I'm not really into politics. I follow sports when I want to root for something. What I want to see is good stuff happen so people can be successful and remove these barriers. So we see a lot more opportunity in our criminal justice system at the federal level. The states are already doing it more and more. What's happened at the federal level with the First Step Act has kind of jump-started it in some levels. Florida just did a First Step Act, which again, didn't get everything we wanted, but it's much better than it was, and we're going to go back for more. We were down, like I said, in North Carolina. They're doing an expungement bill. They're going to do more and more reforms as well. They have a Next Step Act that they're trying to get moving. Tennessee's doing something. Missouri, Arizona wants to do something. So it's going to keep building and building and building, and we need to keep praising those politicians that are doing it. And that's the only way to be. I mean, the bottom line, the First Step Act passed in the Senate 87-12. 2 years before, it couldn't get out of committee because of the politics that were going on. And you had everybody listening to Tom Cotton. Well, they weren't listening to Tom Cotton this time. And that's good for this country, in my opinion, at least on this issue. So, and by the way, I'm a Pats fan. You know what the vote was in the Senate? 87-12. Grady to Gronk, right? Okay, yeah? It's an omen. So, anyway, I had to do that. I'm going to just do quickly some slideshows, me and my buddies at the White House. But this was the first meeting we had on the First Step Act in January of 2018. Before that, we'd done a bunch of meetings with Jared Kushner and his team, working with, it was Doug Collins and Hakeem Jeffries. It was just the House bill we were looking at, and this was just prison reform. And it took a while. We were able to get a lot of data in. The guy, that's Sam Brownback, the guy behind him is Jeff Sessions, who was our Attorney General. And the first couple of meetings that I wasn't in, I heard that they were going well, and then the former Attorney General would start to talk about MS-13, and things would kind of go off the rails. But what we were able to do, we worked with our different groups we work with and put some polls together across the country on different, whoever it was, everybody from the far left to the far right to the Trumpsters to the independents, and we were able to show that 80% plus, pretty much everybody agreed that even if they thought people needed to be punished while in prison, that they needed to be rehabilitated, so they came out better. And so this was the meeting we were having that first, with the president for the first time on this issue. And at that meeting, it was really interesting. We were kind of going, the media was in there, then they left, and we just started talking data and this, that, and the other. And I got called on about second chance hiring and hiring the formerly incarcerated, which we've done at Coke for decades. And I was regaling the president with the data on recidivism and what happens when someone gets a job, and his eyes were closing like everybody else's eyes closed when I talk about that. But something really wild happened. Someone then just put their hand up and said, Mr. President, a guy named Reed Cordish, who worked for Jared Kushner in the Office of American Innovation, he raised his hand and said, Mr. President, you need to understand that the people in prison and their families are the people that you ran for, that you advocated for, that you wanted to give a voice to. And right there, he just lit up like a Christmas tree. And he connected on it. And then, you know, one of the things that was interesting, when Trump won, we were working with a lot of my good friends on the left and on the right. We had all these coalition letters together. We're going to go in and meet a new president and get him or her. Everyone thought it was going to be a her, I think. But get him on board with all these reforms that need to happen. And I remember the day after it, one of my good friends who isn't here today, and I won't name that person, called me, and we were talking. I said, so are we going to go in and meet with Trump? And this person said, are you nuts? There's no chance. We're going to be in the desert for 4 years, blah, blah, blah. And then that person asked me, what are you going to do? And I said, I don't know, we're going to keep working it. We're going to keep grinding, hanging around the hoop. You don't know what's going to happen. We'll work in the States. And then I said, but you know what? Don't forget, Jared Kushner's dad went to prison. And I said, I know that, going back to my story, that's what touched me from a young age. And anybody who's had a brush with the system, they want to fix it. And he said, well, this person said, okay, well, good luck with that. I said, thanks. And then I appreciate that. Anyway, about 2 days later, I got a call from Chairman Grassley's office, and they asked me if I'd take a call from him. And I was like, sure. And so he got on the phone, and he goes, oh, Mark, how you doing? Are the Koch brothers interested in criminal justice reform still? And I go, yeah, absolutely we're interested in it. This is a big deal. He goes, okay, be in touch. Hung up. And then I was like, okay, who knows? Then 3 months later, Kushner was meeting with Durbin and with Mike Lee and with Grassley, and then with Hakeem Jeffries and Doug Collins. 2 months later, we got called in to work with them. And other groups came in, and people like Van Jones, who really took a lot of slings and arrows because he was supporting the bill even though it didn't have sentencing in it at the time. It kind of just kept moving. And the president was really right from the beginning. 2 days after that meeting, a photo here, he was at a retreat, a Republican retreat, and he was talking about something else, economic development, and then all of a sudden he just started talking about second chances and what a rigged system. State of the Union address, he talked about it. It's not fair, these people do the right thing. So I thought we had a lot of progress, a lot of opportunity, and we got through the House. It was a huge, huge vote. Everybody knows who this is, right? It's Alice Johnson. You all know who Alice Johnson is? Anybody not know? So Alice Johnson, she was a first-time nonviolent drug offender who, what I understand, she gave coded messages to drug dealers a couple of times. She had fallen on hard times, not that that matters necessarily in our system. Her husband had left her, one of her kids got killed in an accident, she had lost her job, she had some other issues going on, no money. So she did that, she got arrested, And she was prosecuted, or she was going to be prosecuted. They offered her a plea bargain of, I think it was like 3 years, 5 years, first-time offender. She said to me after, she told me that she would have taken that, but the way they described what she did, it was inaccurate. It made her seem like she was selling drugs to kids, and she hadn't done that. She had done what I just mentioned a couple of times, put the messages out there. So she went to trial, as is her constitutional right. She lost. The government, basically, they were going to make her they were going to give her a pretty good deal, I think, better than what she ended up getting, which was life. But what happened was she became the kingpin, or the queenpin, whatever it is, because that's how drug conspiracies work, and everybody who was more culpable, said, oh, no, it was her, and that's how it goes. So she got life plus 25 years, and she ended up, though, being commuted. Her sentence was commuted by President Trump. And I'm going to give you it's going to be a multiple choice. So how do you think President Trump came to that conclusion to give Alice a commutation? Do you think he called in all the top scholars like Rachel and talked about it and read the Federalist Papers, what Hamilton wrote about, why we need the pardon power for the president in Article 2, brought in, read law review articles? Do you think he did that? Or yeah! And you know what? I love it. And it's a good deal. I think it's good. We need to, the Kim Kardashian model is probably not sustainable. I don't know how many there are, but there aren't enough Kardashians for the people that need to be out from commutations and pardons and that type of thing. But anyway, in all seriousness, I've only met her once, and it was I think you may have met her before, Rachel, but it was at this meeting we had after that. And she's the real deal, and I think you've probably seen a couple other stories. Most recently, like 17 other people got out, and it's just crazy to me. I don't understand social media. I can barely use my iPhone. I'm doing good on the clicker today, so that's pretty good on my slides. But how nasty people are about her for doing this. And it just gets back to this whole thing, like, what is wrong with you? We're getting people out. We want this to be more expanded, and I think we've got a shot on that. I know Rachel and Mark Osler and Paul Larkin and others are working on it to make it a better system, the clemency system. This will be one of the reforms, not legislation-wise necessarily, but one of the things that has to happen in the next step. We don't need a system that goes 6 or 7 times it goes through the Department of Justice before you get a yes or a no. We already know what DOJ is going to say, and I'm not saying that negatively. It defies human experience to think someone who prosecuted someone and locked them up for a long time is going to then say, yeah, let them out. So anyway, we've now got a chance on that because of Alice Johnson, because of Kim Kardashian. The other thing it led to was sentencing reform. And you can say whatever you want about this president, I get it. But once he understood that it's not just people like the Unabomber who get life sentences in the federal system, when he understood that grandmas who were grieving about their lost child and made a bad decision get life sentences, Trump said, this is not right, it's not just. And it led to her being released, which is a great thing. We need to make it better and much more expansive. So he got that as well, which was great, and that led to him supporting the Senate bill. And I know this looks like a vanity thing. I'm the bald guy in the back in case you don't see me. But anyway, this was interesting because we got law enforcement on board. And I remember when we were trying to get the Obama administration trying to get law enforcement on board, it was really difficult. But here, with the law and order president, they're all on board with this. The FOP, the international chiefs, it was great stuff. And I think it helped with the president that there was a lot of focus on the '94 crime bill, and he could kind of pile on what the Clintons did, the Clinton crime bill. Not that that was just the Clintons, it was bipartisan, I get all that. Whatever it takes, And ultimately, here's Alice at the First Step Act celebration that we had about a month ago, beginning of April. And up on stage with her were about 4 or 5 other formerly incarcerated people who were also beneficiaries, not of clemency necessarily, but of the First Step Act, getting out early. It was a really cool day. And what was happening there was Trump made his planned remarks, but he then had everybody up on stage, all the formerly incarcerated people who were not planning to talk, he had all of them speak. And I'm just saying, I don't know anyone else who would ever do that. I mean, I probably wouldn't do it in like in an intercompany thing, but it was awesome. I mean, it was really cool, actually. And it goes back to something, what I said earlier about the first meeting with the president, and when Reed Cordish said that you can give them a voice. Well, that happened that day with Alice and the others on the podium. It also happened the day of the signing of the First Step Act. And what happened there was, again, the president came in and he said he had a speech but didn't want to read it. Then he went on ad lib, which was great. And then he had a lot of other people speak. We had 6 or 7 formerly incarcerated people speaking there as well. And it was testimony. It was kind of like, I've never been in the Oval Office before, but it was kind of like being in church almost. It was so, you know, people were just very excited, crying. And, you know, for me it was going back again, he has given them a voice. We've given them a voice. And that's what we want to see more and more of. You know, and what we're doing now is good. And what we're going to do down the road here is going to be good too. But it's not enough right now. It's not sufficient. It's not moving fast enough. And we really need to up our game. So much winning. Yeah, there you go. Couple of things real quick. What I see, I have 2 thumbs up because I heard the president say thumbs up, but apparently there was an apostrophe, not a plural. But then Sean Hopwood, who's on the far right, you guys know who Sean is? He's the Georgetown law professor who was a bank robber before he was a Georgetown law professor. He doesn't have any thumbs up, so I think I got us all, you know, 1 each. Anyway, that was it, part of the reception. This was kind of the core team we worked with. You see Van Jones and others. And that was a great day, but really we are working hard. Like Rachel and the team are going to fix clemency for us, so I'm going to take that off the list. We'd like to see automatic expungement. We'd like to see a mass expungement, whether it's through clemency, pardon, or just anybody who's got a marijuana felony conviction or misdemeanor in this country, in this day and age, just go away. It's crazy, in my opinion. We want to see bail reform. I know that's more of a state thing, but it's at the federal level. We think that, I already talked about this, that we want to see a system based on risk, not on resources. And we know bail is a big problem and drives a lot of poverty and drives a lot of people getting criminal records in the first place because they want to pay their way out so they don't have to be in pretrial detention. We want to make sure that all the sentencing laws, would like to see mandatory minimums go away. But what I'd like to see is if they're going to do mandatory minimums, I brought this up at the White House that people thought it was a good idea. I don't know if they'll do it. I'd like to see indeterminate sentences. So someone, okay, you're going to get a 20-year mandatory minimum, but we'll check in 5 and see how you're doing. And with all these programs we're putting in now, with the First Step Act, these data-driven programs on skills and that type of thing, we might be able to say, you know what? It turns out all you really needed was a job. And the fact now that you can get a job, we're going to let you out earlier. So indeterminate sentences, meaning you don't have to stay in prison to 85%. We should kind of go back to where we were before. I'd like to see federal parole. Don't know if that'll happen. But more and more sentencing reform. Again, the collateral consequences at the federal and state level, I get it. We need to have some exclusions of people doing certain jobs or being in certain housing situations. But by and large, we should let people who have paid their debt to society come back and just be full members of our society again, be citizens. And when we do that, we get much better outcomes. We've just seen it in the different states. It's crazy, right? You treat people like human beings, give them their rights back, they're better people, we get less crime, less poverty. So that would be the goal. That's about all I had. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them, but we've got a long way to go. And I think we've finally got a chance, though, because as you mentioned earlier, John, in the introduction, the fact of what happened at the federal level is now leading to these virtuous cycles into the state level, and that's going to hopefully lead the federal level to want to do more as well. I'd like to see a competition now of people making the system more redemptive and less punitive. So, if there are any questions, I'll take them. Otherwise, there's a question. Thank you.
So there are index cards in front of you which you can write down and we'll collect them and we'll bring them forward. You can go ahead and ask And I wanted to, Mark, just because we're recording, if you could repeat the question in the microphone, that would be great.
Yep.
So the Florida legislators are now trying to undermine the referendum by requiring felons to pay court costs and fines to get their voting rights reinstated. And my question is why?
Well, no, that's a good question. As I understand it, in the original proposal that the reformers made, Neil and Desmond, in that proposal, they put in there that part of the sentence is fees and fines. And so I think they're following that. I'm not a fee, the whole thing, we didn't even talk about the fees and fines issue and probation, how bad that is for people. But, so that's why I think they did it. My point of view is I understand there's going to be a couple of relief valves potentially for people to petition to be able to not have to pay the fees and fines depending on what they are and how they are. But I'd like to see, I was hopeful that that would go away, but it didn't. And I think part of the problem though is it was in their original proposal and they agreed with that at the time. That's my understanding. So that's why, and the question was, I didn't do that. Florida Amendment 4, they're requiring people to pay their fees and fines before they get their voting rights back. So hopefully that'll get fixed though, and it could get fixed down the road, I don't know. But we want to see people back voting. We think it's very important. Yes, sir.
Really enjoyed your slide of the overview of the different areas of needed criminal justice reform. I wonder if you've given thought to the critical role of law enforcement. Think of the recent exonerations in Chicago that were all tied into police misconduct. Think this new concept called victim-centered investigations, which means we presume the guilt of the suspect. There seem to be so many issues with law enforcement that we should be thinking about.
So the question is policing reform potentially, and our foundation, the Charles Koch Foundation, is doing a lot of work on that with communities and with law enforcement, including one of the people that in the slides was the head of the FOP. At that meeting we had at the White House, he came up to me after and thanked what our institute was doing, working in Indianapolis on these issues. So we think it's a big deal. Excuse me. I think that a couple of things. I think we need to reform the laws. Part of the problem is we've got, prisons are a catch-all for every social malady these days. We just lock people up in prison. You got a mental health issue, you got a substance abuse issue, you're poor, just get out of here. And so I think part of the problem is law enforcement's jobs. I don't know if they're really equipped to do a lot of those things. I'm not suggesting anything like, someone shoots someone and all those types of things. Saying we should let law enforcement kind of do the job that they signed up for. If we could change our laws and get that fixed, that would help. I think that, I do think that law enforcement has a really, really tough job. And again, if someone does the wrong thing, and police brutality, not a fan of that, to state the obvious. But we ask them to do all the things. It's kind of similar to people who are prison guards, deal with all the things we don't want to deal with, we don't want to see it, we don't want to hear it, and they deal with that all the time. And I know there are issues out there. I know there are bad cops, just like there's bad professors and bad lawyers and bad everything else. But I do think, to the extent the work that our foundation's doing with a lot of these different urban areas on these issues, and I think that hopefully over time that's going to change as well. But I'm a fan of, your question, John, earlier about should there be whatever immunity. I don't think law enforcement has absolute immunity. They have qualified immunity, right? Which I kind of get. But prosecutors have absolute immunity, right? And that's just crazy. Because I think law enforcement, again, really tough jobs. They don't know. They stop someone on the side of the road. They have to go to someone's house. Something's going on. It could be their last call. And I'm not in any way trying to diminish the issues that do exist. But I think that there are ways to deal with this. And I think people are trying to do it now. And the things that happened in Chicago hopefully will be a thing of the past.
So I thought it was interesting how pragmatic your description of the process with the First Step Act is. Hey, if Kim Kardashian is what gets President Trump's attention, whatever works, right? So I'm curious, putting on that pragmatic hat, if you were to think over the next year to 2 years, what do you think the best low-hanging fruit at the federal level would be to
Well, I had hoped, I didn't mention one because it had already been shot down when I brought it up at the White House. I'd like four laws were changed in the sentencing reform provision of the First Step Act, and only one of them was retroactive. Ironically, it was the one that they didn't make retroactive when they passed it, the Fair Sentencing Act. I think they should make all those other bills, other laws, retroactive, particularly if you think about it, 924C, Weldon Angelos had become the poster child for that. I don't know if you know Weldon, but you got 55 years, first-time nonviolent offender because of gun stacking rules and the mandatory minimums, the way they just were allowed to stack them, even though he had no record prior to that. But Weldon, if he hadn't been released from prison under the Obama administration, he wouldn't have benefited from that bill, of the changes in the law. So I think that should be part of it. I think a lot more, hopefully, diversionary programs at the federal level will start to become a thing. There's more and more of these pilots out there. And again, I'm going to go back to, I think it's really low-hanging fruit, are expungements, and then particularly mass expungements of things like the drug laws, drug crimes, depending on the situation. And I know they did that back after the Vietnam War. That was more the mass pardons, I guess, or something. But I think that would be something, I think hopefully we get, one of the things I've been focused on is trying to make sure that BOP implements the First Step Act. That's a big deal, because I'm concerned if they don't implement it, then they're going to say, see, it didn't work. And they're right. If you never open the box, the thing never works. But we're really focused on that. One of the things I brought up at the DOJ listening session a couple weeks ago when I spoke, it was on the risk and needs assessment tools, and there were about 20 people there. I spoke 19th, which was good because I don't know a whole lot about that stuff. So instead, what I said was, look, you've covered all this other stuff. I said, there's two things you can do that could really change things for you from a culture perspective. I said, the first is, I said, I worked in Worcester, Massachusetts in the Worcester County House of Correction in the early 1980s. This is 2019, you're still the Bureau of Prisons. Join the 80s, So I said, change your name, and then why don't we take you away from DOJ and put you under Health and Human Services, because this is supposed to be about rehabilitation. And they look so shocked. I was like, wow. I don't know if they'll do anything. But if they do, they can name it after me maybe, I guess. I don't know. But that's some low-hanging fruit. I think that hopefully we're going to see more and more changes in just the laws, how many there are. And then I think we need some prosecutorial reform. That came up at the White House discussion we had. That was just at the White House discussion. Has to go through DOJ, you know where that's going to end up. But I think if we don't focus on the power of prosecutors and their, with plea bargains and everything else, I think it's just, we're never going to be able to change things. So the only way to change it is to reform that, give people, anyone who's in the system, a qualified lawyer, even if it's, it's someone who's indigent, they need a lawyer to handle their case, and that'll be okay. But if they're not going to do that, then they're going to have to change the way that grand juries work, I'd say. They should get rid of the trial penalty. That is something we're working on as well. Some of the team is putting together a white paper on that for the White House to look at. I think that would be important. Those are some things there. Yes?
I would think on the low-hanging fruit, though, it's the reactivation of the Commission of Forensic Sciences, which is pulled into DOJ. Has that been part of any of the discussions?
I'm sorry, say that again?
The reactivation of the Commission of Forensic Sciences, which got pulled into the DOJ under the new administration. I don't know if was that part of the discussions?
No, that's a good one, though.
Yeah, it is good.
Yeah, so what's the name of it again, the third time? I'm sorry, I'm a little tense.
The Commission on Forensic Sciences, which was started after the National Academy of Sciences report.
Yeah, the
session
forensic.
ended it, saying we can do our own, basically.
Okay. Yeah, no, well, I'll bring that one up on forensic science. That'd be good, because I do know, going back to you mentioned Sessions, when we were at the White House, Sean Hopwood was talking. Sean's a guy who was the bank robber, now a professor, just to remind you. He was talking to Sessions after we were done, and I talked to Sessions, I'll talk about that in a second, but Sean was talking to him about reentry issues and recidivism and how to reduce it, and Attorney General Sessions brought up a paper from 1974 that said that people just need to live within their means. And Sean said to him, Mr. Attorney General, you need to update your research. which is pretty good to come back. Yeah, I talked to the Attorney General about reentry programs and telling him the groups we work with, through our Stand Together groups and others, and he just kind of looked at me. I said, you know, some of these, we're getting down to 5% recidivism rates because they're getting jobs, they're getting educated, they're less violent. He just kind of looked at me, and he just shook his head, and then he asked me, do you know how much drugs cost right now? How much drugs cost at the border? And I'm thinking, this is a trick question. In the Roosevelt room, the Attorney General asked me to find out how much drugs are. Yeah, I'm not falling for this one. So I just said, I don't know, sir. He said, well, they're really cheap. And I said, yeah, that's part of the problem, supply and demand. It's an infinite, that's why drugs always win. Anyway, so I'm not surprised that you wanted it under him. I think if you got, it should go under the, back to, whatever that, what's the other group, the Academy of Sciences or whatever it is. It probably should be under there. I think they're trying to do more there, but a lot of it is, a lot of it's slowed down right now. I guess I'll just put it that way with everything else going on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
If I could just jump in on this good point, this is something we've talked about here with and we think it's a policy tragedy that there's not an independent commission on forensic science, and so I'll make this is not an unfunded mandate, it's an unfunded aspiration, is we think, like, if the government's not gonna do it, there needs to be an independent forensic science commission, and we have at Penn the cross-disciplinary expertise that this is something where, as we think bigger and bolder down the line, and maybe with the help of some of you, we would, we have the scientists, we have the physicians, we have the criminal justice expertise to do this if the government, but it's so essential for our justice system that there be an independent check on this forensic science.
Yeah.
Just going to add to that, so I'm from Houston.
Mm-hmm.
Run the crime laboratory for Houston. And the Texas Forensic Science Commission, if you want a group to come work with to learn, there are a number of places where that commission has been viewed as basically a commission done right.
Mm-hmm.
I work a lot with them. I think it would be, I am a strong advocate for, we need national level on this.
Oh, that's great.
But
We'd love to come
John
see you
about
in
Texas Forensic Science Commission already, so.
It's like you're planted in the office.
Yeah, you know?
You have some work.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I second what Peter just said and what was said about the Texas Forensic Science Commission being very good, excellent, and it's the best lab, thanks to Mr. Bromwich over here, who did the analysis of the old lab. But Mark,
Yes, sir.
what was just said about the independent entity in the federal government on forensic science, you're so right. It should be the recommendation of the NAS in 2009, and I guess we're in the 10th anniversary. It had to be an independent entity in government. And the truth is, working with Valerie Jarrett and others in the White House, we did the best we could, but it wound up as this partnership between DOJ and NIST, which is a good scientific institution. And, we had to say to, the NAS panel that they were right and the compromise was wrong, because as soon as the new administration got in there, they just absolutely threw it all out. The one person on the panel is not a bad person, Ted Hunt, but he virtually voted against every one of the recommendations that came out of the NAS, the National Science Commission, and he is now the czar of forensic science in the Trump administration. So I have a good relationship with him. He's not a deliberate bad actor. He has his views, but his views were the absolute minority, and he's now the czar. Hopefully, if this president is reelected, I don't favor it, but if he is reelected, maybe we still need that independent entity. And you of all people know it, because I'm like you, I'm a basketball fan, I'm a sports fan, but partisanship should not play any role in science.
Yes, sir.
As cost-benefit analysis can consider to be added to the process of reentry, because if you actually do a cost-benefit analysis of what it would take to develop a package
The question was about a cost-benefit analysis for people coming out. And I agree with you. Everything is, in my opinion, everything is cheaper and better than prison. So I agree.
Because I know this is making it difficult for your reporting, but one of the things Barry's comments were just bringing to mind for me is one of the recommendations in the NAS report was the separation of crime laboratories, forensic laboratories run by the law enforcement and prosecution. And having been part of removing a laboratory from a law enforcement agency, it is a bruising and difficult process. But it is something that if there were more advocacy for how to help organizations do that, I think that would be a big benefit for all of us and our friendly country.
No, I agree. I'm taking notes. I'm always learning. But thank you.
Please join me. Thank you, Mark. Again.
Thank you.